at an August 3rd rally in Georgia, Donald Trump, who can't even remember the name of his own doctor at times, managed to remember the name of 3 members of a Georgia election board, which normally most people wouldn't know their names, but he said them specifically at the rally: Janice Johnson, Rick Jeffries, and Janelle King. One of them was in fact there, stood up and waved. That was Janice Johnson. Now, the fact is, the reason why Trump knows their names and has actually posted quite a bit on Truth Social about the Georgia Election Board is because that is where the fight is for this election. And a huge lawsuit trying to stop the efforts by Trump and the RNC to disenfranchise voters in Georgia just came out. A Harris-backed lawsuit filed in Georgia is devastating and shows what's been happening with the Georgia Election Board, why that's undemocratic, and why the court should intervene. So let's step back, talk about this. I've been reporting about this on MeidasTouch. You might have seen some of those videos, but to give you a little bit of context. So as we know, Donald Trump tried to take over the election in 2020 by unlawful means. He tried to call the governor of Georgia and ask for more votes. They also tried to have fake electors. Now, this, as we all know, didn't succeed. In fact, it succeeded fairly miserably, into the fact that some of the lawyers involved in those court proceedings got disbarred, such as Rudy Giuliani, and they're also facing criminal sentences for their unlawful means of trying to become fake electors in order for to stop the actual certification and transition of power to Joe Biden. So they've learned that after the fact, they don't have as many levers, legal levers, let's say, to use in order to stop the transition of power. So their strategy is changed a little bit, and the strategy is the most apparent right now in Georgia. So in under a year, the Georgia Election Board has managed to become a majority of election deniers. Rolling Stone has reported about this, the social media posts of the board members being really apparent to deny the 2020 election as valid. We have one of the 3 election deniers on the Georgia Election Board, Rick Jeffries, who has already asked Trump for a position at the EPA level. This is the level of corruption. Even Janice Johnson, by showing up at that rally, there's actually an ethics code prohibiting her from doing anything partisan, and yet she showed up at the rally. So what happened was, a few days after that August 3rd rally, the Georgia Election Board passed a rule changing the certification requirements. On August 6th, they passed a rule that will go into effect September 4th. And what it says is that the county election officers can certify an election after, quote, reasonable inquiry. That's what they've added, a reasonable inquiry, and they can examine the documents. This is what they have added to the election process in Georgia. The Harris campaign will specifically, we have Democrat election officers in Georgia. We have voters in Georgia. We have the DNC and the Georgia Democratic Party all coming together to sue, to file in court, asking the court for declaratory relief, saying that this new rule should not stand, is unlawful. They have not asked for expedited hearing at this point, but they may still. But they are trying to prevent this rule from being in place when the November election comes. The reason why this is so imperative, this change in the rule, is because right now, under Georgia law, what the county election officers do is, at the lower level, they count the votes, they print out the tabulation, they seal it in an envelope, and they pass it on to at the county officer level. They open it up, they confirm the tabulation, and then they send it up to the Secretary of State, who does the same thing, and then it eventually goes up to Congress. What they are only supposed to do is basically check the math. Was the math, the tabulation, correct? And having, let's say, chain of custody with the tabulation. And so that is the role. It's a ministerial role. And the Georgia law is very clear on what that role is, to check the math and to have it go up the chain. So what they are trying to do is to add, by adding this reasonable inquiry, they're basically allowing the election deniers at the county level to stop or delay the certification. Right now, under Georgia law, they have to certify the results by Monday at 5 p.m. after the election day. That's the deadline. And then the federal law has other deadlines. So if they delay the certification past that because they're saying they need to do their own inquiry, then we have chaos. We have actual chaos. We have legal chaos. Does Georgia not certify their vote at all? Do they certify it with certain counties? Does that delay the whole federal system from certifying because one state hasn't sent in their tabulation? This is chaos. And this is why the Harris and the DNC are asking for a declaratory relief from the court. So right now in Georgia, it's not that you can't ever say people could actually make mistakes. There could actually be fraud. But the avenue that the Georgia law allows for fraud, if you have some sort of suspicion of fraud or et cetera, you do it through the courts. And you do it through the courts because you wouldn't want the people who are tabulating the votes to then also be in charge of deciding whether or not fraud occurred. I mean, you wouldn't have that in any other system. You would want a third party neutral position to look at any possibilities of fraud. And so that's how you do it in Georgia. Once it is certified, the party has a certain period of time to ask for a recount, to claim that there's some fraud or that maybe it was, within the margin of error. And so that is the legal process for if there's any question of whether or not fraud was committed. Now, Trump knows this because they tried this. They tried so many different recounts in Georgia and they failed because the vote was properly counted and what resulted was Biden. And so they know that there is a mechanism for how do you handle suspicions of fraud or, let's just make sure that this was done correctly because that is what happened in 2020. So they're not looking for a way, let's say, of ensuring that the election is being done fairly. They're looking at a way to stop the certification. And if you have election deniers have more leeway for stopping it, that's how you can stop it. And then in a lot of my videos that I put out, people would ask, but why? Why would he want that to happen? Because it's a little bit different in 2020. He's not in power. He can't stay in power. Biden is in power. So how does stopping the certification help Trump? Okay, great question. I mean, for one, I think chaos always helps Trump. He feeds on chaos. Once you have doubt in the system, and he will use that doubt, he will say, the courts stopped their reasonable inquiry, right? And then that becomes the narrative that there was that they were not able in Georgia to make sure it was fair. And he uses that narrative, who knows, for another riot, for another insurrection. He will certainly use that to go up to the Supreme Court. Typically, you would say the Supreme Court would kind of side with Georgia law. And it's not just Georgia law that is on the side of the Harris campaign. It's also the Republican Secretary of State. And it's also the governor, Brian Kemp, who even the Georgia Election Board continues to put out new rules that are undemocratic and has actually just asked the Attorney General for guidance of whether or not he can replace Georgia Board of Election members. So this is a Republican looking to replace Republican Georgia Board elections because of how outrageous and how undemocratic and how illegal their attempts are to disenfranchise the vote in Georgia. So Trump's best, effort is to try to get to the Supreme Court. I mean, they did him a solid with that immunity hearing. They did him beyond a solid, something that was really bad law that we're going to have to deal with for a long time. So he may not be that unreasonable to think, well, if I can get this up in front of the Supreme Court, maybe they will side with me. Maybe they will issue a decision that goes my way. Why not try? And so that's, I think, their strategy. Sowing chaos to get their supporters to believe that this is not a fair election again. And who knows if they're going to do, call for some sort of violence with that. And also to get up to the Supreme Court. There are enough Trump appointed judges who we've seen. Judge Cannon, I'm talking about you, who completely dismissed his charges regarding the classified documents case, despite the fact that it's really clear law that we can have the attorney general can appoint special counsels. So he's had success in judges going his way at the district level, like Judge Cannon, at the Supreme Court level with the immunity. So this is why he is calling them out at the rally. And not only that, but that latest rule that they just put forward, even beyond this one with the reasonable inquiry, they actually had American Doom found emails where the RNC was copied on these, directing the Georgia Election Board how to proceed with these rules. So this is an effort, an organized effort about how to disenfranchise voters in Georgia, because they know they can't just get more people to vote for him. Isn't that a novel idea? If he could just get more people to vote for him, they wouldn't have to try to come up with rules that are against Georgia law. But when you can't get people to vote for you validly, you're going to try to do it in this sneaky way. And I know there was a lot of outcry when this first was reported of like, what's happening? What are we doing about it? Well, this is what we are doing about it. A declaratory relief filed in Georgia from the Harris campaign calling out what the Georgia law is. Just so we're all clear, this is the Georgia statute that governs. It says that each superintendent within his or her county or municipality shall exercise all the powers granted to him or her by this chapter and shall perform all the duties imposed upon him or her by this chapter, which shall include the following: to receive from poll officers the returns of all primaries and elections, to canvass and compute the same, and to certify the results thereof to such authorities as may be prescribed by law. So if you see there is no reasonable discretion written into that Georgia law. So the Georgia Election Board, which is trying to add a rule, not change the law because they're not the legislature, but add a rule of reasonable discretion, conflicts with the Georgia law. And their specific rule that they passed, that is now at issue in this lawsuit, is to, quote, certify the results of a primary election or runoff, or words to that effect, means to attest after reasonable inquiry that the tabulation and canvassing of the election are complete and accurate, and that the results are a true and accurate accounting of all votes cast in that election. So adding in there a discretion that Georgia law doesn't account for. This should be something that they've received declaratory relief on, unless for some reason we have an election denier judge. So we have that in the legal courts, and we have the governor, Brian Kemp, trying to replace or asking the attorney general whether or not it's possible for him to replace these Georgia election boards. So stay tuned for Georgia. This is where democracy is at issue the most right now in this fight, to allow voters the ability to cast their votes and to be counted in the 2024 election.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Midas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.